What is up, Pacer Nation? Welcome to the Pacer Pulse podcast, the heartbeat of Indiana basketball.
Welcome, welcome.
And today I wanted to do another Pacers What If episode. And if you've been a fan for this team for a long time, let's say, this one may hit a little close to home. And actually, maybe thinking back on it now, it might not raise up any bad or bitter feelings in you, considering what became of this. But today I wanted to do a Pacers What If on what if we never traded Paul George. And I think this was pretty polarizing because for the longest time, the fan base was vehemently against Paul George because the man basically asked for a trade at some point. He told us he wasn't going to re-sign with us and that he was looking to leave. And it really just sparkled like a downward trend and to our team's history. I mean, we were already pretty bad whenever he was on our team last, and there's just some different things I want to go over because it's fascinating to kind of look back on. But what if we didn't trade Paul George? So kind of like I want to kind of paint this as like not equivalent exactly, but look what happened whenever we didn't trade Miles Turner or he just signed with a different team, even though we didn't know that was going to happen. We basically just got left empty-handed. So that's essentially what we did with Paul George, of course. He told us, hey, I'm going to be looking to leave. I don't want to re-sign. So we traded him and got some assets for him, which we know I'll talk about what it all became eventually. But I was just wanting to think about, like, what if we didn't trade Paul George and we kept him and even though he told us, hey, I don't want to re-sign, what if we were somehow able to convince him to stay? What would our team look like and how would our future have shaped out to be? So let me go into, because I had to look it up. I knew like some of these players that we had on the team at the time, but I didn't realize just how bad it was because it was pretty awful. And I remember this last season that Paul George was with us, and I think it was like the most angry I've ever been watching this team since I followed this team because they were just the most infuriating team to watch. And let me just break down who was on the team here. So this is the 2016-17 Indiana Pacers. So if you've been a longtime fan, this might strike a chord with you because trust me, I'm sure I wasn't the only one that thought this was so hard to watch this team. But the players on this team during that time, it was Paul George, Miles Turner, Jeff Teague, Thaddeus Young, Monte Ellis, C.J. Miles, Al Jefferson, Aaron Brooks, Kevin Serafin, Lavoy Allen. So that was kind of like our main rotation. And then we had Rakeem Christmas, Glenn Robinson III, who we all thought had more potential than what he really had. Joe Young, if you remember the Paul George Gatorade commercial, I mean, I guess Joe Young had some moments here and there. Rodney Stuckey, who was like hurt a lot, but he was part of the rotation too. And then Ben Moore, who was just, like the 15th man. So think of that team. And what's even more shocking is I had to relook it up because there wasn't a whole lot I remembered exactly about that team back then and like how good we were. It just seemed like we were terrible from what I remember because it was so infuriating watching that team. Somehow they were better than what I thought. But that year we were a 42-40 team, but we got swept in the first round by LeBron and the Cavaliers. And Paul George averaged like 24 points in that series. But we just didn't have we didn't really have anybody on that team. Like, it was awful. Like, Jeff Teague essentially was our second best player. And don't get me wrong, he was like an okay point guard during that time, but he averaged like 16 and 8, something like that. I mean, not really setting the world afire. I remember I was excited about the signing at the point in time because, he had some good years in Atlanta. He made the All-Star team at one point in Atlanta. So I was like, oh, this is actually a decent signing, but obviously it didn't really pan out with our team. And then we just drafted Miles a year before. So we had a promising center that we thought because Larry Bird talked him up as like he could potentially be the best Pacers of all time with our team. So there was a lot of expectation coming in. And just that team as a whole, I'm just trying to think of like, what if Paul George didn't get traded? And what if we tried to keep him and try to get him to stay? How would we have had any sort of path to success with that team? I think, honestly, like if we would have tried to keep him and maybe re-sign some of these guys, patch together some of the roster that So like some of the free agents that there would have been after that season. So it was going to be Jeff Teague was on an expiring after that season. Al Jefferson was, and then CJ Miles. So that was like almost a total of, let's say $23, $24 million that you were going to lose. And yeah, maybe that's enough, especially back then. The cap wasn't as high. People weren't getting paid as much, like what we're seeing today. So maybe that number would have been like a star level number almost, or at least like a solid starter. I don't know it per se, but yeah, I mean, but then nobody was coming to Indiana during that time. Like nobody wanted to come to Indiana. We have always been a harder free agent destination, which thankfully that's kind of turned around now since Tyrese and we were able to convince Siakam to stay. And that's like probably our biggest free agent signing in team history with Siakam, in my opinion. I get it, like we traded for him first, but just being able to re-sign him like that, I'm still gonna count it. But like over the David West thing for sure, which was like our biggest free agent signing before that. So nobody ever really comes to Indiana. So cap space didn't really mean a lot. And then on top of that, we just didn't have the trade assets. So I remember when Paul George was here, and something he kind of complained about after the fact was that we weren't trying to win, essentially, is what he was saying, because he said he knew of a guy that wanted to come to Indiana, but we didn't want to do what it takes to trade for the player. And it was rumored to be Anthony Davis. And during this time, this was like prime Anthony Davis. I get like he won the title with the Lakers later on. Maybe not prime Anthony Davis, but like before his prime. But he was like, I mean, the big thing in the NBA during this time, right? So imagine, let's say, like compare it to the Giannis situation now. Davis was almost on that tier of like a Giannis then. Maybe not obviously MVP level Giannis, so maybe a little tier below. But I'm just trying to paint an equivalent picture of this was like the guy he was talking about us like wanting or him like wanting us to trade for, and with what assets is what I'm going to ask, because like I said, we had what I just named on our roster. Who on this roster would New Orleans would have wanted for an AD who was like ascending, was a dominant player, was literally just dominating the league during this time. So we had, like I said, Miles Turner, Jeff Teague, Thaddeus Young, Monte Ellis, CJ Miles, Al Jefferson, Aaron Brooks, Kevin Seraphin, LaVoy Allen, Raheem Christmas. I mean, which of those guys would the Pelicans have wanted? And okay, yeah, we have draft picks, but they weren't going to be good draft picks. Like if we got Davis and paired him with Paul George, that team would have been a top 2 or 3 team in the East as long as we could piece together decent guys around those two. But they weren't going to be good picks. And then what? I guess we had some expirings we could have offered, but why would the Pelicans want to do that? So it was just kind of nonsense to me how he kind of held that against us. It's like, dude, realistically, look at the team we had. What assets do we have to even obtain a player of that stature at that time? It was like this the most bizarre, kind of delusional thing. And I know Paul George has kind of like exposed himself as being delusional, especially with his podcast and just some of the things that he says. But I was just trying to think of like, what if we didn't trade him? And I think we would be on like that treadmill of mediocrity, even probably to like this day, just kind of like the Bulls, like that team that stays in that 40 to 40, like 500-ish type team every year. Not bad enough to get a high picks, but then not good enough to really be a threat or win anything. Just kind of like a consistent first round exit. I think that's the path we were going to be heading on, because if we even re-signed Paul George too, that would have been such a huge cap hit to our team. So it's not like he was going to take any pay cuts to like try to bring other guys in to be able to afford other guys, even if guys wanted to come to our team to play with Paul George, and which is very highly unlikely. And we were already paying some of these guys like more than they deserved. And like I said, I don't know, I don't remember the salary situation at that time, but like Monte Ellis, if you guys remember him, completely horrendous for our team. That dude was so infuriating to watch, and I get why we acquired him at the time, because we thought he was a different player, but I don't even know if he was in the league after he was with our team. There was like literally 3 or 4 guys from this roster that were out of the NBA after that season, I'm pretty sure. That's how bad it was. And yet somehow we still won games. And maybe that's a testament to how good Paul George was during that time. But and then we had Monte Ellis on a like $11 million a year deal, and he was just a hard guy to trade. Like nobody wanted him because he was playing so poorly that year. He wasn't an asset. Then Thaddeus Young, he's honestly one of the guys we would want to keep if we were trying to trade for somebody else and build around Paul George. Like he was making 14 million a year. He was a solid player, but probably a little overpaid for what he provided. So he made out well on that. I mean, Miles was on his rookie deal, so that was a good deal, even though he was like a rookie, basically a first year center or second year center. He was okay, obviously, early on in his NBA career, but nothing special. Then Rodney Stuckey, he was making like 7 million a year, which is, like I said, that sounds like nothing now, but like back then, that was a huge hit to your cap space when a guy like Rodney Stuckey is pretty terrible, wasn't even playing. So we had a lot of money tied up in guys that were essentially not impactful besides maybe Thaddeus Young. And then even the guys that were coming off the books, I mean, nobody was going to come to Indiana. So we really had our hands tied. Like, even if we decided to bring back Paul George, overpaid him, not overpaid him, I guess, because when we did trade him to OKC, he had a phenomenal season. I mean, he was like borderline MVP at one point level. So I'll give him that. He was balling in OKC that one year he was there. But just the fact that if we would have re-signed him, and let's say he did play at that level with us, we still would have been capped at like a 7th or 8th seed in the playoffs, or maybe even a 6th. Just that mediocrity, and we just had no avenues to really build around him. And I just think that if we didn't trade Paul George, that's what we would have been. And we never would have hit this path that we were on now, where we made the Game 7 in NBA Finals. That's for sure. And it's just a big what if. Like, what if we tried to convince him to stay and we didn't trade him? And we see that with some teams where they try to hang on to a player. Like, I think this is what the Bucks are going to try to do with Giannis. They're going to try to hang on to him and hope they can reconvince him to recommit to the team, maybe make some desperation trade that's only going to hurt their team even more. Kind of like when they trade or assign Miles Turner, and just something that cripples your team, and maybe it doesn't even change their outlook on if they want to leave the team or not. So we definitely made the right call in trading him, but just like, what if we didn't trade him? And I think we would have been kind of like the Chicago Bulls, like to this day, I'm saying. I mean, who knows if like eventually we would have traded Paul George anyways. I don't know, because maybe we would have saw the writing on the wall. Or I know how this Pacer organization is. We would have tried our best to just piece mediocre players around him. Like, I mean, I get like Bojan Bogdanovic was like decent when he was with us, but you know what I mean? Just like Darren Collison, like those type of players that don't even really move the needle for you. You're just a tough out type of team. You always hear like, I guess like growing up, you always hear like those teams where coaches are like, yeah, they were a tough out. They were a tough out for our team. We don't want to be a tough out for the really good teams to have to go through. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I feel like we would have been on as a team. And I think that's what path we would have stayed on if we did like just try to keep him and not trade him. And maybe it gets even worse, where his trade value would have been even worse. I mean, obviously people around the league knew that he was wanting out and wanted to go to LA. That was the big thing, and cool, whatever. But didn't work out in his favor in that way. And thankfully we were able to get like extremely good assets in return, because as you know, we got Oladipo, we got Sabonis in return. Sabonis, he ended up being like one of my favorite Pacers players in probably a long time, probably since I've been following the Pacers. He's in the top 5 he was just like such one of my favorite players. And then Oladipo became an all NBA player. And there's other what ifs I could do with that scenario too, but we saw where that led, where we used Sabonis to trade for Halliburton, and that the rest is history. So if we didn't end up trading for Paul George, it could have been, or trading Paul George, excuse me, it could have been detrimental to our franchise. And we would be talked about in the same vein as like the Chicago Bulls. What are those other teams? I guess I can't really say the Sixers because they've had a few decent years, and then what are those other teams that are just always stuck in the middle? I just always think of the Bulls, and that's kind of the one that sticks out to me right now that I'm thinking about. But just those type of middling teams, and that's literally like NBA purgatory, because you never have a chance of being good. Like, yeah, we drafted Miles with like the 11th overall pick, but if you go back and look through all these drafts and whatnot, how bad a lot of those picks are in that range of players that don't even last in the league for very long. So I'll give Miles props for that. He at least has been in the league, and it's going to continue to be in the league for like quite a while at least. So, but there's usually only like 4 or 5 players that stick around in the NBA, especially after that long of a period of time, out of each draft class. But it's just not a good spot to pick in. I mean, obviously you can find the outliers like a Devin Booker at 13 who we should have drafted over Miles Turner that year. And then, the Jokic's in the second rounds, the Ginobili's that people always say. There's different examples, but it just it's very unlikely. And I think that it just would have been rough, Pacer Nation. I'm just gonna say that. And as much as it hurt for Paul George trying to leave and force his way out the way he did, and just the way he exited wasn't pretty, but it literally blessed us into being able to get Tyrese eventually down the road. And we were fortunate enough for that. But like I said, like the cap situation with that team was just awful. We are already over the salary cap with all those guys on that 2016-17 team. Just had no cap space. All our money was tied up in like non-level all-star players, or like basically just like solid vets, I guess you would say. We only had Paul George. Like I said, there just was no avenue for us to even get better as I was looking at our salaries and whatnot during that season. And we just couldn't add another star player next to Paul George. And then the fact that nobody would even want to come and sign there, trading for one was extremely hard because we really had was our picks and maybe Miles Turner, I guess. I don't even think he was like a blue chip prospect then. So he ain't swinging no big trade during that time. It just would have been very ugly. And I think as bad as it is this year, we at least know there's a light at the end of the tunnel with Tyrese coming back, and hopefully he'll be the same Tyrese. But and we're gonna have a top 3 to 4 pick. Hopefully it falls in that range, and we have a chance to kind of add a franchise piece to what we already have now, which is not what many teams have the opportunity to do. I know like the Warriors had that chance, of course, and they swung and missed on James Wiseman, so it's never guaranteed. But hopefully we can hit on that pick. But it's just a fun exercise to really think about, like, what if we didn't trade Paul George and we went through this whole cycle. And maybe the biggest what if like we didn't end up trading him is we tried to convince him to stay and he just left for nothing. Like how far set back would we have been if that happened? We easily would have been the worst team in the NBA. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, like I said, that roster that I just mentioned and like read off to you guys several times now, horrendous. Like just there ain't no way that team would have been more than bottom 4 of the NBA. And maybe that would have been a good thing. We could have drafted like a high pick and had shots at some of these guys that came in through that time. Who knows? I don't know. That's always a big what if too. But it would have really set us back pretty badly. And you always want to get some sort of assets for your guys if they're not going to want to stay. Just kind of like how we wish we would have gotten with Miles whenever I guess we could have maybe worked out a signing trade, even though there ain't no way like Milwaukee was going to want to do that, especially with us because we're rivals with them. I just don't think that was going to happen, but they just came out of nowhere too. So it's unexpected, but still, it's just such a huge blow whenever you lose an asset like that and don't get anything in return. And we're kind of seeing those repercussions now because now we're scrambling to try to find a starting center for next season for when Halliburton comes back. And now we're going to have to give up other assets to do that. So it just you really see like how much of a domino effect that has whenever you do lose a player for nothing like that. So granted, even though we would have been horrible, we would have had chances at top 3 picks for probably 3 or 4 years in a row. And the lottery was obviously different then, so we would have had higher chances at that. But still, it would have been a lot of rough basketball. And maybe it would have been better than what we had to deal with, even with Oladipo and Sabonis, but they were at least an exciting team, and you could see a foundation with those guys, and obviously that went south, as we know, and obviously trading Sabonis for Tyrese Halliburton changed our franchise forever, so like I say, you take that 10 times out of 10, but it's a huge what if, Pacer Nation. There ain't no ifs, ands, or buts about that, and who knows, even if we didn't trade Paul George, what if we were just like the Wizards now, where they're terrible for like 8 years in a row, and they have picks that you don't really have anything to show for it, I guess. And kind of like Charlotte too, like maybe we'd be like them right now, where they're just consistently bottom five team in the East, I would say. And like how our team has always been in our franchise history, where they're always like not wanting to bottom out. They're always trying to want to be competitive. So we would have tried to sign some mid-level guys or guys that don't really move the needle, but make you just good enough to kind of be a middle of the pack team. That's literally what we would have been, and I think we would have still been on that trajectory if we tried to keep Paul George. And what if he just left for nothing? So I don't know. I'm very thankful that he left and that he wanted to leave. Yeah, I was hurt about it during the moment, just like I think all Pacer Nation was, because he was our guy. I mean, those teams were like some of my favorite teams in Pacer history. I mean, the Roy Hibbert team, the Paul George, Lance Stevenson, George Hill, David West. I mean, you got Luis Scola off the bench. I think CJ Watson was a part of that team. I can't remember. But like, they were a tough team and they had a strong identity, a strong like defensive identity. We were a hard-nosed team. We weren't going to back down from anyone. Lance Stevenson blowing in LeBron's ear. Like, I will never forget that moment. It was just classic Lance was so hilarious. He was so volatile, but you love to have him on your team. And I was a big Lance supporter, but he gave us a lot of good years. But at least I will say he gave us a heads up that he didn't want to be on the team. If I'm trying to find like a silver lining in that, and but like I said, we always could have went the other direction and just tried to do all we could to try to keep him. And kind of like what we're seeing with the Bucks, like I mentioned earlier, now where they're going to like extreme levels. And really, like, if he does want to leave, yeah, they'll get a good package for him, but it's really going to handicap their team still. And they just got to pray that they can get like an awesome package in return. Because if not, it's not going to be pretty for them for quite a long time. We're talking like Chicago Bulls level. They don't have their picks for like a very long time, so they have to get picks in return, pretty honest. And maybe like a young star level ish player is what you can hope for. Which obviously he could command that. He's borderline MVP candidate every year, so he's that good. And even Paul George was in that level. So imagine, if we were in that situation, it wouldn't have been pretty. But all in all, Pacer Nation, I'm not trying to ramble on about it. It's just a big what if to think about because, man, it could have got ugly very quick. And I would like this. Probably should have looked up too, like who the free agents would have been if he like, let's say if we didn't trade him and we tried to convince him what other free agents could have been in that class. Where we had, like I said, we were having cap space open up close to 24 million. So yeah, that probably could have got a pretty good starter for that money. I mean, your team was pretty much terrible outside of that, anyways. And like I said, 3 or 4 of those guys are almost out of the league after that season too. So that really is a testament to how bad that team was, and the fact we even made the playoffs with that team is shocking. So honestly, I was so after I went back and looked at it, we were 42-40 that year. That was shocking to see, but just incredible outcome. Honestly, like a dream scenario of your star player for the longest time led you to some of the highest highs we'd seen in the longest time since the Reggie Miller finals days or finals day, and I don't know. Yeah, it was rough going through, but all in all, Pacer Nation, I wouldn't have changed it for the world. I don't think anybody else would have, considering what happened, what became of it. But it was a big Pacers what if to me, and that's really just my biggest takeaway from that. We would have been on a treadmill of mediocrity until today, and I don't think that would have changed. I think we would have been set back for 10 years as a franchise, and thankfully we got lucky. We got lucky, Pacer Nation, and I remember even the trade package we got for Paul George, people were kind of hating on it because Sabonis, it was only like his first or second year in the NBA, I think, and Oklahoma City was trying to make him like a stretch big, really not playing to his strengths. And then Oladipo was still like a wild card. And the fact that like, both those guys blossomed once they came to our team, and that wasn't even a byproduct of more opportunity, I would say. I think they just didn't have that potential fully tapped into. And I loved that Oladipo team and Sabonis team, and I really did love Oladipo during his time with our team as well, until the whole asking Miami to trade for him, that whole mess and how it ended up being pretty sloppy towards the end there. And then Sabonis, always liked him as a player. I mean, I think he always represented the franchise well. And yeah, him as like Turner was a weird fit. And thankfully we were able to get Halliburton in that. I was still extremely happy for that. I remember I was at work whenever I saw the Sabonis for Halliburton trade, and my jaw almost hit the floor. I was so in shock. I just never thought that would happen. So it was a good domino effect, Pacer Nation. So thankfully, I know he'll never hear this. He'll never listen to this. He will never know who I am. But Paul George, I want to send you a thank you. I want to thank you for asking for a trade during that season because it ultimately led us to Tyrese Halliburton and us making the finals for the first time in 25 years almost. So thank you, Paul George, and best of luck to you. But I'm so glad we traded you, and we don't have to think of the what if of like, what if we kept you and try to build around you still and convince you to stay? Because who knows how that could have ended up. But I hope you guys enjoy these Pacers What Ifs, Pacer Nation. I really enjoyed doing them. It's fun little thought process to kind of go down memory lane too and just remember what happened, what situation we were in with a team during that time. And like I said, that was our most frustrating team I think I've ever watched. And I've been a fan for like probably 20 years, I would say. Back in the Jermaine O'Neal days, I wasn't able to necessarily watch the Reggie Miller teams. I wasn't quite old enough probably then or fully immersed into basketball like I am now. But like I said, very, very rough team to watch. It brings back pain in my memory just thinking about that team. I don't think I ever yelled at the TV more than I did during that time watching the team back then. But yeah, like I said, I really hope you guys appreciate these episodes and kind of enjoy a trip down memory lane and just kind of start jogging the thinking of like, man, like it could have been really ugly or just these different what if scenarios that could have happened. And if you guys listen to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I would really appreciate a positive review if you enjoy the episodes. And I also post these kind of episodes on YouTube. And I would love if you guys want to leave comments on there and we can talk about, what you guys think would have happened. I would love to engage in that kind of conversation. And obviously, you can't do that on the podcast platforms, but that's why I post these kind of episodes on YouTube because I think it'd be cool to get fan interaction. So I would love to hear from you guys, and maybe we can build some sort of group or community in the future where we can talk Pacers basketball because it's just fun to do. I mean, I think we're all trying to find those outlets to talk about our teams in that way, and I would love that. And I would love to if you guys subscribe as well, if you will enjoy the podcast. And the only ones I don't really do on YouTube are like game recaps because I want to keep some things separate at least. So there's going to be some episodes you won't fully get on YouTube, but these type of fun episodes, trade episodes, different things like that, you're going to get all those on YouTube. But like I said, we'd love if you guys subscribe, leave comments, like if you want. I really appreciate it in general. It would mean a lot to me, and it just means a lot that you would spend your time even listening to this if you are. So I can't thank you enough, Pacer Nation, and I will talk to you soon.